Well, hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Tom Banchoff. I'm a Vice President for Global Engagement at Georgetown University and also a Senior Fellow in our Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. And I'm really delighted to welcome you all today to a conversation with my friend and colleague, Dr. Jose Casanova. Hi, Jose, how are you?
Fine, fine. How are you? A great pleasure to be with you as always.
Wonderful to have this time together. As you all know, our topic today is public religions in the COVID-19 world. And I might add sort of how we got here and where we're going. So it's a vast topic, which will give us an opportunity to range widely. We'll try to discipline ourselves, though, and leave plenty of time for Q&A at the end of the session. So you can already start posing your questions, and we hope to get to as many as we can. But first, before I introduce Jose, just a word about the genesis of this event. As Jose well knows, the Berkeley Center had been planning a celebratory conference last year to mark 25 years of his landmark book, Public Religions in the Modern World, which is now, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, Jose, I believe been translated into 8 languages. Yeah, roughly 8 languages. And I know there's a Japanese edition being republished again this year. Now, of course, we're going to we've had to put off that celebration. We'll have a conference next year. It'll sort of be a long quarter century after the book came out. But what you've done is really remarkable over the past 12 months. You've organized a series of in-depth conversations with global experts on religion and world affairs, many friends and colleagues of yours. We've had Charles Taylor, we've had Hans Joas, Nilofer Gülle, and others, and I really recommend to everyone out there to go take a look at the collected videos. You'll find them under the heading, the series Global Religious and Secular Dynamics, 12 in total, if we include this one, the final in the series, all organized with the fine partner organization that I want to recognize, Reset, Dialogues on Civilizations. I also want to note that, like those previous discussions, this discussion will be videotaped and shared with you all, the link once we're done, and we hope we'll gain a wider resonance on the web as we go forward. So, as I said, Jose, now's our chance to talk to you. We've decided to together to divide our time into 3 broad topic areas. We'll first look at your landmark book, Public Religions in the Modern World, talk a little bit about its genesis, its reception. Then we'll zero in on the global role of the Catholic Church in the long historical view, but particularly with a look at Pope Francis in our current moment. And that will lead us in our 3rd segment to a more general discussion of the role of religion in the COVID-19 world and beyond, a particularly fragile moment in the complex processes of globalization we're all living through together. And the role of public religions will indeed be fascinating as we look forward beyond this historical moment to the post-COVID-19 world. So, Jose, people really know your work well. I don't want to assume, though, that everyone on this call is familiar with it. So just a couple of words of background. Jose is one of the world's leading sociologists of religion, a former president of the Association for the Sociology of Religion, and the recipient of many awards and honors, which I'm not going to enumerate here. Jose grew up in Spain, studied theology in Innsbruck before moving to the United States to the New School for Social Research as a graduate student, and later as a professor, rising to the rank of a full professor there. Before in 2008, we at Georgetown were fortunate enough to recruit him to join our community as a professor of sociology, but also as one of the founding senior fellows of the Berkeley Center. And Jose, it's been a wonderful time. You're still an active member of the Berkeley Center family as a senior fellow, and you've retired now as of last year from the Department of Theology and Sociology. So you wear the august title of emeritus. Well, I think we should probably launch right in, given the time constraints. And again, I want to remind people to pose their questions on the Q&A function. You publish so widely on so many topics. We tried to narrow things down just a little bit and thought it made sense to gain some insight into your intellectual trajectory, to go back to the book published in 1994, Public Religions in the Modern World, a time when religion was reemerging as a global force. Think of the Iranian Revolution, the rise of evangelicals in US politics, the global papacy of John Paul II, a surprising development for many, given the expectation that the world was supposed to become more secular. Here, religion had arrived again as a powerful public force, and your book really addressed that incredibly fascinating and ongoing phenomenon. So tell us a little bit about the genesis of the project and your basic argument.
Right. There were mainly three issues I tried to address. One was, how do we understand this so-called religious revival, global religious revival? I was not the first one to point out to it. There were many, many theories floating around. The return of the sacred, David Bell was the first one. And then, of course, discussion of fundamentalism, the desecularization of the world. I was unhappy with all of these general analysis of what was going on. And so I came with the idea of deprivatization. That's kind of the key process happening. So this is one aspect of it. And I actually had already begun in an essay which I wrote in 1987, The Politics of the Religious Revival. I sort of tried to set out this question, but I didn't have any answer myself. The answer came by my own empirical work, involvement in the transitions to democracy in Spain, Latin America, Eastern Europe, and seeing the role of the Catholic Church in those transitions. And those were actually the first three chapters of the book. The chapter on Poland, and Spain, Poland, and Brazil were published separately before the book. At least the sections on the transitions to democracy were published separately several years before the book. And then the third question was the debates around secularization, kind of the European thesis of secularization that says it's going to be a global process. Every modern society will become increasingly secular. Americans say, no, actually, this is a particular European phenomenon, free market. So I tried to basically give an answer to these three questions. I gave an analytical distinction of three modes of secularization that had to be differentiated: general differentiation of the spheres, the decline of religious belief and practices, and what I call privatization of religion, which was the core of my thesis, of my argument. It was not so much about the other decline of religious beliefs and practices, also not so much about differentiation theory. It was challenging the thesis of privatization, both empirically, it was not happening, obviously, and in this respect, it was a response to what's happening in the world. But also normatively, I wanted to challenge liberal theories of democracy that argue normatively that religion ought to be a private affair because it threatens democracy if it enters the public sphere. So it was, in this respect, it had an empirical argument challenging empirically the thesis, but most importantly, for me, it was challenging the thesis normatively.
So as you say yourself, it really grew out of your interest in a set of cases where the Catholic Church was a key actor. In the reception of the piece and your overall theoretical argument, there was a conversation that you've also taken part in about how global the argument is and how it might be extended to other parts of the world. Could you talk a little bit about the reception of the book in that particular global perspective?
The reception first, it surprised me because the book had been basically hatched by my own at the New School. The New School was a very secular place, very few people interested in religion. My own students had no interest in religion, but kept taking courses with me that basically developed the different chapters of the book. So I had never been a member of the Sociology of Religion Association. I have never presented in meetings. And suddenly the book came out and it really, really immediately changed the debate. But yes, I already pointed out in the introduction that this was a Western-centric study, but precisely the pretext pointing to the Iranian Revolution, pointing to the race, to the rise of the moral majority, and pointing to other areas of the world was very, very clear that it was not only a Catholic phenomenon, but it was a global phenomenon. But I argue that I will come later and will deal with this issue globally later, because one has to challenge first the theory within the West before one can begin addressing the theory behind, because otherwise you address the theory outside of the West and people say, yeah, well, because these people are not modern yet, and therefore your theory doesn't count. Eventually they will be like us.
So let's spend a couple minutes on the theoretical discussion. As you pointed out just now, there are elements of the secularization thesis you are not challenging. The idea that the spheres are being differentiated, that religion is being separated from the economy, politics, and the like. Even the idea that religious belief might be in decline in large parts of the world. You accepted then and you accept now elements of those two aspects of the thesis?
Well, basically what I argue against the Americans that were saying that secularization is a myth, I say it's not a myth. In Europe, it's a reality, it's a very, very real fact. And yet the theory, the European theory explaining why Europe is so secular is wrong. It's not modernization that explains European secularization, but at the point I had no response myself, but something else, because modernization in the US and in many other parts of the world didn't lead to religious decline. On the contrary, led to religious revivals. Therefore, we have to separate the two theses. But also differentiation, obviously it has been different in the West, even within the West in different parts. So we needed to have a much more comparative historical analysis of process of differentiation and how they affect these dynamics. Ultimately, it's a comparative historical argument. I never attempt to develop a general theory of anything. I think that general theories are not very good in social science. If they are too general, they are to a certain extent so general, so abstract that they don't tell you anything about reality. And basically, as a social scientist, my approach is comparative and historical. So the argument was, let's do true comparative historical analysis of these three different processes. How the differentiation of religious and other spheres takes place, when it takes place, how much and when you have declines or rise religious revivals, and third, to which extent religion remains a private affair, when does it enter the public sphere?
And maybe before we move on to some specific, more contemporary topics, how did the reception of the book influence your, your own thinking, and how has that thinking developed? Are there elements of the thesis that you've adjusted in your own mind since then?
Very much, especially because the only person I was debating those issues at the New School was Talal Asad. We were teaching together a seminar on Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. And the first truly serious critique of the book. Otherwise, there were practically no other major critique of the book. And for me, the most gratifying was the fact that all the historians of the 5 cases agreed that basically my analysis was correct historically, irrespective of whatever empirically, analytically interesting the thesis was. But it was this argument that I simply gave at least too much power to the differentiation thesis, and that I didn't consider enough the fact that this was part of what he calls the triumph of secular reason over religion. And so I then began to get into the whole issue of secularity and secularization, secularisms, the secular. And of course, then came the work with Charles Taylor and Hans Joas. And so this is a second project beyond public religions, the whole argument of multiple secularities, multiple secularizations, multiple secularisms.
Good. Well, we'll have a chance to come back to some of these subsequent ideas and literatures, but let's move to the second part of our conversation, which is to do a bit of a deeper dive on the Catholic Church as part of the constellation of the return, if you like, of public religions. And there, I've always been struck by one of the arguments that you make that's a theme throughout your work, about the astonishing, really, transformation of the Catholic Church in the modern era as a global player, as a global actor. If you think back to the 19th century, the church was really on the defensive, very isolated, had lost its temporal power in Italy. The Pope had retreated behind the walls. The Vatican was launching attacks on modernity in all of its forms, it seemed, against liberalism, against socialism, even against the idea of religious freedom. And yet here we are a century later, and already this trend was evident toward the middle of the last century. The church is a global player in many ways. It's not insisting, as it once did, on its institutional prerogatives, its temporal power, which was once a central focus. It's very much engaged with the wider world. And as a result, you argue, has actually become more influential from that low point of its influence in the 19th century to becoming an important force, an important global actor in its own right. Can you talk a little bit about that transformation and what was driving it? And then we'll bring it up to today, because obviously the church faces a range of challenges today.
I mean, again, probably the most important move I made methodologically goes away from comparative historical analysis of nation states. It was, my argument was still organized in terms of case studies of comparing nation states, to go to the global level of comparative historical analysis at the global level. Not necessarily of cases, of national cases, but to look at the global unit as a comparative process. And I wrote this essay in 1997, the one you are referring to, Globalizing Catholicism and the Return to Universal Church. And there I tried to make the argument that obviously, if you look at the history of the Catholic Church, has always been embedded in very different worldly regimes. First, the Roman Empire, then the medieval system, then the system of nation states, and now a new world regime was emerging, within which precisely the Catholic Church was assuming an important, if you wish, almost pioneering role. Yes, at the end of the 19th century, very few people had given even any chance for the papacy to survive. When at the year 1900, only 4 countries recognized the Vatican state, only 4 countries, 4 Catholic countries. And then slowly throughout the 20th century, it goes, and today basically, other than a few communist countries and Saudi Arabia, practically every other country in the world recognizes the Vatican. But this is not only the question. The question is that for the first time, the popes, who only claim to have spoken urbi et orbi to the city and to the globe, really only in the 1960s, they began. First, already before, Radio Vaticana had become a global radio. And the Vatican had very clearly begun to communicate directly with Catholics all over the world, beyond the Iron Curtain, all over Asia, all over Africa, all over Latin America. But the most important thing was the new encyclicals, and basically this is what the aggiornamento means, that the church assumes a new relationship of dialogue with the world, the church in the modern world, which of course means the modern world, of course, means in seculum, right? Modern world is seculum. So this is actually the title. The world, I mean, the church in the modern seculum. And so it really is an understanding of a new relationship to a regime, but also to a new age which is starting. I was struck later when I began, when people began talking of globalization and social scientists that began to develop theories, how the Council Fathers already had recognized the fact as a sign of the times, that we are entering a new global age in which humanity was becoming one, in which diversity, plurality, the need to recognize human rights, the dignity of the human person, and the need to work together for the global common good. So the idea that the popes were the first ones to go beyond the international system of states and begin to talk to global humanity as one. And to think that, and this is of course the fundamental, I would argue, task precisely of global religions that we are seeing, but we can leave this for later.
Yeah, well, let's come back to that and maybe look at one historical example who figures prominently in your work for good reason, Pope John Paul II. Is he an example of not just a religious leader, but a political leader? And if so, how do you think about the influence of the church? Is it moral authority? Is it the mobilization of Catholics within national political systems? Is it both? How do you think about that?
I mean, in his case, there is a unique role because of his role already having to fight with communism in Poland and his certainty of having survived communism. So there is something specific about Paul II, John Paul II. But already John the 23rd, the way he incorporates human rights, begin to go to the United Nations. Paul VI is speaking to the United Nations. Their encyclical Pacem in Terris and Populorum Progressio, those are really encyclicals addressing global issues. Pacem in Terris comes after the role that John the 23rd plays in the mediation of the Cuban crisis. So now here you have the two superpowers, which are at the point of basically entering nuclear war, and they have to recur to some kind of mediation. And we are go back then to the Middle Ages, in which the papacy plays this role of international court of appeals precisely to pacify conflicts. So in this respect, I'm more interested in the structural role of the papacy than in the way in which particular individuals occupy this role. Yes, John Paul II had a unique charisma, and obviously the way he became a world traveler and the way he was able to basically communicate with the masses everywhere. He was a charismatic leader, and because of that, a very authoritarian charismatic leader also. But I've always been struck, if I always insisted, look at the 5 last popes: John the 23rd, Paul VI, John Paul II, Benedict XVI, and Pope Francis. 5 great popes, radically different one from the other, and yet all of them having made great, if you wish, contributions to the role of the papacy in global affairs and within the church. So this is what also is interesting about the role of the papacy. Has really taken on a unique role now that didn't have. It always claimed, of course, to be the supremacy, but it was only insisted as a dogma in Vatican I, and before there was no real contact between the Pope and the faithful. So, of course, the papacy became the core of Catholicism. But precisely because of that, popism, popery was a negative concept. So the question is, how do you go from being something negative, popis, popery, to become something positive that basically plays a role in which it's accepted as something positive, even for non-Christians and for other civilizations?
Yes, and yet if we look at the contemporary world, right, the church faces a range of critical crises, internal, external, crises of legitimacy. Think of the clerical sex abuse crisis, think of issues of gender and sexuality. Are we at a new inflection point where we're seeing the limits of an opening to the world, or the way in which that's going to continue to generate controversy within the church and beyond?
Yes, and obviously the sexual scandal, sexual abuse scandal is critical. I've always argued that compared with the way I talk about the Catholic bishops playing precisely this public role in the public sphere of American society and economic issues and political, geopolitical, and then losing their public voice, and then being afraid of speaking publicly and basically tying themselves to the moral majority, to the evangelical right, and then becoming involved in the polarization, in the culture wars of the United States. So, of course, if you wish, the Catholic Church can only play this role if it can claim as to speak in the name of the common human global good of global humanity. But once it gets stuck into the very global culture wars and takes sides on it, then of course cannot play this role. And this is what has happened with the bringing moral confessionalism, when issues of gender and sexual ethics became the core identifying what it meant to be Catholic. So Catholicism was defined by the position in those gender issues: abortion, contraception, same-sex marriage. Once this becomes, then of course, you are simply part of the polarized global politics or national politics. And then, of course, you cannot play the role of precisely this attempt to transcend these divisions, to try to work for whatever the public common good is. And of course, this is the great attempt of Pope Francis, seeing that what had happened with Wojtyla and with Ratzinger, namely with John Paul II, and with, was that the church was stuck on moral confessionalism. It was very clear in the second election of President Obama, when the Catholic Church was stuck with the whole issue of same-sex marriage, when everybody else in the United States, including the Republican Party, moved ahead and forward. So it was a recognition that we have to go back to, as he calls it, the hierarchies of truths. The truths of the gospel are the core of the Christian message. The other truths, obviously, he says, I'm not going to change them, but they are not what defines us as a Christian church. They are important, and we have to open a debate about them.
Yeah, I think we can come back to Pope Francis for certain, but I wonder if, just to push you a little bit on the idea that the church can stand back from the culture wars. Yes, in certain areas, certainly in the sort of militant, narrow way that you've described. But let's take the issue of gender and the role of women. I mean, here's a cultural issue, a global issue that the church has to face head on. Wouldn't you agree?
Right.
Yeah.
Yes, but there are different ways of facing it. When the 1848 Communist Manifesto emerged, and the specter of communism, and then, of course, because of the specter of communism and class war, the Catholic Church very clearly took sides with the bourgeoisie against the working class and against socialism. Eventually, however, the social question that was, you could not avoid the social question, you had to, but then you have to try to develop a response which is above the melee, which tries to find the common good that is neither a bourgeois answer nor a working class answer. So to go beyond the class warfare and basically to try to address the fundamental issues of what the social question is all about. And the Catholic Church, after 100 years of Catholic social teaching, has a very good record of having developed ethical principles to address the social question that basically go beyond what socialists and capitalists have been saying, and has survived and has really, really proven. So what I'm saying is the Catholic Church and gender issues is at the very same phase of the social question in the middle of the 19th century, has not yet begun really to address which aspects of the gender revolution are positive, because they enhance the dignity of the human person, and because they contribute to the common good, especially common good and women, and which aspects are perhaps problematic precisely because they, instead of enhancing the dignity of the human person, leads to the exploitation of individuals, especially of women, as part of the sexual revolution. So again, what I'm arguing is that the Catholic Church has to address, but it cannot simply repeat basically arguments that come from a pre-modern conception of natural law and the sexual division of labor and so on.
Good, good. Well, let's come back to Pope Francis. And you pointed out some of the structural continuities in the papacy since Vatican II. Clearly, there's a sense, though, that Pope Francis, and you alluded to this yourself, represents a new departure, going back to the gospel and the fundamentals, re-engaging with the world. He calls it a culture of encounter. To what extent is that influenced by his being a Jesuit? In other words, is there a particular way of engaging with the world that one can identify with the Society of Jesus? You and I worked on this, on a book and a project, but that was early in Francis's papacy. And now I think we can reflect a little more on that long historical impact on what's unfolding today.
Well, first, I don't want to make the issue that he's the first one to go to the gospel. The gospel is at the core of the message of all the previous popes as well, so there's no point here. The argument is that their own encyclicals and global issues are still within the dynamics of what could be called global capitalism and this is what's very clear in Jean Paul II Centesimus Annus, which is the first look at globalization, but they're still very much still within the notion of global capitalism, or within the question of the global system of nation states, the Westphalian system being globalized, and issues of war and peace and nuclear disarmament, etc. What is new in Pope Francis is the recognition of these new global challenges, which neither through capitalism, through the market, nor through the system of nation states can be addressed, namely environmental issues, immigration, refugees, and now very clearly the pandemic. Those are global challenges that no single nation state can address, but also that the international system, the way it is formed, has difficulty addressing. So this, I think, what is new about Pope Francis, a recognition. Now, this comes, yes, partly because of his Jesuit background, partly because of his Latin American background, his own experience in Argentina, obviously, seeing those problems. But yes, the culture of the encounter is crucial here. The recognition that we've entered a new global age in which a new dynamic of globalization is particularly important. As you know, we've argued about the three phases of globalization: the pre-modern before Western hegemony, the Western hegemony one, and now the contemporary one. One could also argue of three different dynamics of globalization. The one which creates a single, uniform, homogeneous, relatively world capitalist system based on division of labor between center and periphery. A second is the world system of nation states, which you have is plural, but not pluralistic. They are all basically copies. Nation states are copies of each other. And then you have the emerging world system of religions, which is not only plural, but pluralistic. There will be not one single global religion. Not all religions are going to be the same or similar, are going to have the same structure. The same, all nation states have similar structure. But each religion claims to be unique and different, and having the right to be unique and different, and yet demands recognition from the rest of religions as being, if you wish, valid for all of humanity. It is this in between universalism and particularism that characterizes this religious pluralism. And this is for this, only the culture of the encounter, only the recognition of each other. It is the process of recognition of the differences and the similarities, our common humanity, and yet that each of us has a different response to the challenge of humanity, and we have to recognize and work together. So I think this is what really makes the culture of the encounter crucial for our global age, because we recognize that neither the global capitalism nor the world system of nation states can address these fundamental new global challenges. We have to do it through the culture of the encounter of mutual recognition and everybody working together for the common good, despite our differences.
Very good. Well, that's a wonderful transition to our last set of questions, which really bring us to the current moment and the challenges we face amid the pandemic and looking forward. Let me remind people to please submit questions through the Q&A function. We're going to have plenty of time for a wider conversation. So let's talk about this moment against the backdrop of your comments now about the wider constellation of public religions, religion, and the secular on a global level. We've seen a pandemic. We're still, alas, in the midst of a pandemic, which has revealed and, of course, exacerbated a range of problems. You've referenced some of them. Among them, the rise of inequality within and across societies, strains on solidarity, or what Pope Francis calls fraternity, but also the crisis of democracy, coupled with the consolidation of autocracy in different parts of the world. None of these are new, but the pandemic has really revealed fissures, as you pointed out. Is there a new role for public religions? You're suggesting there is at the intersection of these various crises. Could you elaborate a little more how you would see a new possibility for—
Obviously, all of this is very complex. We are in the midst of a radical transformation, global transformation, and we don't know where we are going. We know what the old system was, and the old system cannot function well, but we cannot simply replace it with something new. So we simply have to a certain extent, try new ways. Now, what the pandemic has revealed above all was precisely the strength of nationalism and the nation state, the national interest. For me, what was most revealing, I was in Europe at the time, and most revealing those days, even the European Union, the Schengen system, in which there were no borders. With the pandemic, every single European nation state unilaterally, without consulting with anybody else, simply closed their borders. And then the national interest becomes basically preeminent. Now we know that ultimately we are all in this together, and without solving the pandemic at the global level, we will never be safe. So it's not only a question of solidarity, it's a question of self-interest. So this is where I talk about the new global challenges. It's not the old in which you have winners and losers. You know, in the world capitalist system, yes, there was center and periphery, and the center got ahead. There was a division of labor, inequality, but the new inequality is different because it's not anymore geographically center and periphery, but it's now internalized within its nation. This is what is the crisis. You have now groups of people within its nation that are not needed by the capitalist system. The so-called the discarded people, the people that feel they are not needed anymore, and they are therefore discarded. And this actually, in this respect, Pope Francis is a better political economist than the old Marxists that they still talk of exploitation of labor. The problem today is not that labor is exploited, but rather that capitalism, in order to reproduce itself, doesn't need a lot of or much of the labor is not necessary. And therefore, this is the real problem of solidarity for the global capitalist system. The same goes with the system of nation states. A recognition that, yes, we've lost sovereignty and we have to recover it. But the problem is that the recovery of sovereignty will not solve these global challenges. So we need to both work together in a way that, and here is where I think the principle of subsidiarity comes in. The need to look at different levels of solidarity and different levels, so if you wish, administrative or governmental responsibility, accountability. And the principle of subsidiarity is that the lower instances should do what they can do on their own, and the higher instances should not intervene and take away from them their responsibility. But when the lower instances, our local governments or national governments, cannot do it, then the higher instances have the obligation to intervene. So it's not that the nation state ought to disappear for the sake of a global government, but it is the need to create higher instances of governability which somehow are responsible and accountable to precisely the national level, helping them when necessary, but also demanding from them when necessary. So, and here is where the transnational civil society has to be a fundamental force. If you wish, the impulse to do something to solve these global challenges cannot come solely from international agreements, although these are very important, because ultimately the states are still accountable to respond to those treaties, but has to come from a push from social movements, from organized groups, from solidarities which crisscross transnational processes. And here, whether it is, we call it transnational green movements, transnational feminist movements, transnational pacifist movements, transnational, let's say, groups for helping immigrations, transnational public health, let's say Doctors Without Borders. And here is where religions, precisely because all of them are being reconstituted today as deterritorialized global ummas, what I would call them, they can play a crucial role in serving to form these transnational links for solidarity, for fraternity, for mobilization of public opinion if necessary.
That's a very hopeful horizon. At the same time, aren't we seeing the resiliency, as you point out, of national identities and the instrumentalization of religion for political ends? Think of the ideological polarization in our societies, the salience of left-right divides over and against the secular religious divides. How do you mobilize religious movements, religious ideas and institutions in a world where nation states are so resilient and political ideologies are so dominant?
Yes, because even both, we the people, popular democracies, even those which are not democracies at all, call themselves people's democracies, has become the fundamental way of organizing both our identity and our politics. But the problem is precisely that these global processes, European Union, transnational dynamics, transnational capitalism, have basically taken away. There was a project of territorializing, nationalizing everything, nationalizing the economy, nationalizing culture, nationalizing the language, identities. And obviously, we are beyond that. Things cannot be contained within the nation state anymore. There are global media, financial processes, human migrations. But ultimately, our political response, the only one that we have, which is at least the least bad, is democracy. But democracy is contained within nation states. So unless we create new structures of responsibility, of accountability, of division of political labor, if you wish, that go beyond the nation state, we will not be, yes, people will go back to the nation state because their identity and the recognition that this is where I can make a difference because my vote counts. So we will have to create democratic structures of some kind that go beyond precisely the nation state. And until we don't do that, and of course, it's not a question of some cosmopolitan technocrat creating these structures for the world. It has to be, as I said, through a process of recognition from below in global civil society.
Okay, well, let's take a look at a couple specific countries. I know one of the things you've been working on the last couple of decades as you've expanded your scope in a more global direction is China and India. So here are two examples of countries with deep religious, philosophical traditions, political cultures that are close to, but in other ways very different from those in the US and Europe. Let's start with India, which is an interesting case now because of the rise of Hindu nationalism in politics there. Is this an example of religion in world affairs of public religions? Is this the instrumentalization of a religious tradition for political ends? How do you fit that into your overall approach?
Well, both China and India were great civilizations that as response to the colonial, if you wish, humiliation and exploitation in the case of India, they had to recreate themselves as nation states. But as nation states, they have difficulty of precisely bringing together their own internal diversity and plurality. The Chinese emperor could have no problem dealing with Tibetan Buddhism. It was part of the system, or dealing with the Uyghurs and with others. So there was internal diversity within the Chinese system. Also within India, it was tremendously pluralistic. But then comes the formation of the nation state, and Hindus and Muslims that had been together for centuries could not be together and had to separate themselves into Pakistan, East and West Pakistan, Bangladesh. And even now within India, we know the difficulties for recognition of this minority, 10% of the population which is Muslim, but 10% of the population which is Muslim means there are as many Muslims in India as there are in Pakistan or in Bangladesh. And so on with every other group. So once what is a civilization, a religion becomes territorialized, becomes nationalized, then it enters into the whole problem of polarization of nation states. This happened to Judaism, right? Judaism was the global diaspora religion, has no territory. One has become territorialized through the nation state and reproduces all the problems of the nation state. We see it right now in what is going on in Israel right now, the difficulties of an Israeli nation state to create conditions really for Muslims and Jews and Christians to live together. So this is the fundamental problem. We have to look for ways of recognition that go beyond the nation state, and that precisely they are transnational dynamics. The Chinese nation state cannot incorporate the Chinese abroad, the Chinese diasporas in Indonesia, in Malaysia, in Hong Kong. It tries to do it by bringing them into the territory rather than civilizationally. But then within the Chinese nation state, the Tibetan question, the Uyghur question cannot be solved. So this is the fundamental. We need to go beyond the nation state precisely to be able to address those issues of pluralism and diversity. And this is what I call the world system of cultures and religions that cannot be neither reduced to the capitalist system nor to the system of nation states.
All right, well, that's a very good transition to some of our questions. We've got quite a few here coming in. Let me ask one that relates to your point. Maybe will provide a good way to draw this part of the conversation to a close. From David Buckley, our former student, now colleague. How do you think the growth of religious nationalism in many parts of the world relates to the religion's existence as a transnational or deterritorial force? Does this point to potential limits on the globalized or transnational character of public religion?
Well, of course, Christianity was first territorialized and nationalized everywhere. World War I was the war of nationalism per excellence. And it was the time when every religious leader in France, in Germany, in Italy, in the UK, were basically, this is our, God is with us, this is our war, it's a holy war. And the only voice saying you are all crazy, killing each other for what? The only sane voice, one of the, other than a few leftist prophets and pacifists, was of course Benedict XV, telling Catholics in Germany, in France, and Italy, you are crazy. This is not what we Christian means. And yet nobody listened to the Pope then. Of course, it could happen that if nationalism triumphs everywhere, it becomes again the fundamental way, the primary imagined communities. We know this is the Benedict Anderson's imagined community. If it becomes the primary and the only imagined community, we the nation, we the people, but the national people, not we humanity, not we basically some larger units that may not be the nation state, then we are in trouble. So of course, I'm not predicting that things are going to turn well. What I'm saying is that we need some impulses that precisely can free us from religious nationalism.
We have a couple questions related to Canada and secularism as a value. The government of the Canadian province of Quebec instituted their version of secularism as a core national value. What is your view on secularism as a state or institutional value? This is a way of bringing India back in, for example, as well. You've written about secularism, secularity in many ways. How does it relate to our conversation here?
Well, I've always argued there are two types of secularism: ideological secularism, which has to do with the theory of history about what religion is and ought to be or ought not to be, and then secularism as a statecraft. It's a way for states to manage religion. And of this political secularism, there are two main types. There are those which actually try to protect religious pluralism and to protect, if you wish, the equality, to be fair and recognize all religions. And to assess this is the model for Canadian secularism as a whole. And then you have the model of laïcité, which is the French model and adopted in Turkey and adopted to a certain extent in Quebec. Quebecois secularism is very much close to laïcité, which is basically an attempt to privatize religion and basically to create a public sphere free from religion. And here the funny thing is that Quebecois secularism is basically post-Catholic secularism. Catholics do not recognize that the Christ is there in the let's say in a public room, in class, in a school, or in tribunals, in let's say in city halls, and will not accept any Muslim symbol because this is not our cultural symbol. So you have a form of cultural Catholicism that becomes established, although people themselves have abandoned religion. It's the same as in France. So now laicity is used actually to protect a Catholic, post-Catholic culture from the challenge of Islam. And to a certain extent, of course, Indian secularism was an attempt to save what was left after Pakistan, after the terrible, terrible massacres of Hindus and Muslims both ways, going back and forth between Bangladesh and India, and between Pakistan and India. And to precisely, let's live together. We're still majority Hindus, but we still have a lot of minorities, Sikhs and Jains and Christians, and of course, Muslims. And this was the project. But then the project of Hindu nationalism is a secularism, which basically is based on majority principles, majority rule, and the majority basically defines the culture of the nation. So there is an element in which the modern secular state has to, at least to some extent, try to be neutral vis-a-vis worldviews, ideologies, not to be a Marxist state, not to be a liberal state in the sense of ideology, but also not a Christian state, but also not an anti-Christian secularist state. So it is this need for a neutral, a relative secular neutrality, which is what I consider to be the fundamental task. We need secular states because it's the only protection for religious pluralism around the world.
There are some interesting European cases where you've got official churches in a democratic context, or churches that benefit from close relationship with the government. There's a question here from Mary Jo Curley along these lines. Could you comment, is it possible to have a church-state partnership and still maintain a healthy separation of church and state?
Well, again, I argue there is no single model which should be globalized. The best we can do is simply to improve on the particular models we have. There's no point in bringing the American model to France or bringing the French model to America. But each model can be improved, can learn and become better, pragmatically better. Obviously, the model of the Scandinavian countries, Lutheran countries, is established churches. But established churches which are controlled by the state, and therefore controlled by democratic parliaments, and therefore open to toleration and pluralism. So they are not obstacle to religious rights of minorities. But nonetheless, the more you have new immigrants, and this is why the Church of Sweden in the year 2000, precisely to avoid even what remains of establishment and to be able to incorporate better Muslims, decided to become a non-established church. And it adopted then the role of serving to protect, if you wish, religious minorities from the secularist majority in the country. And this, the Church of England has taken on this role as well, of protecting Muslims against what otherwise will be a secularist majority trying not to recognize the role of Muslims. So here again, there is no particular solution. The French, the Italian, the German is a corporatist one, recognizing first the two churches, the evangelical and the Catholic, and then adding the Jews. Now they're trying to add a Muslim church. Well, those are pragmatic adjustments that are necessary. So democracies are supposed to learn and change as we the people change. The people changes and the country should change accordingly.
Well, we're moving around the world with these questions. Yeah, keep sending them in. There's no country, no part of the world Jose cannot comment on expertly when it comes to religion and politics. For example, the United States. So the context for this question and a couple of others is that component of the secularization thesis that predicted a decline in religious belief. And as you and others have argued, the United States, at least until now, has been an exception in that levels of religious belief, affiliation with Christianity in particular, have remained fairly high until the last couple of decades, where polls show that only 2/3, as opposed to 80% now, identify with Christianity. 25% of Americans are unaffiliated or say they are unaffiliated with any particular religious tradition. So the question arises, and I'll pose it here. It's really about the exceptionalism of the United States with respect to this dimension of secularization. Is the United States moving in the same direction as Europe? How do you view the increasingly prominent view, Richard Camino asks, that secularization is happening in the US, even though belatedly?
Well, it's happening, but not in the same way as in Europe. I mean, the problem with the old thesis was based on the notion that religion is traditional, Gemeinschaft, and modern societies are Gesellschaft, and there is no room for Gemeinschaft within Gesellschaft. This is the way in which the traditional theory was put. Religion was understood as a traditional thing that goes back to traditional societies. But religion in America was never a traditional thing, was always a very modern thing. Religion is not that people were very religious before independence. It was actually, they only became more religious after independence with social mobilization, with religious revivals, with democratization, with capitalism, with the growth of civil society, schooling, etc. So American religion is a product of American modernity, not something before modernity that will disappear with modernity. And this is what has happened in much of the world. The religious in India are not traditional residues that somehow survive. They are products of the mobilization against the British colonialism. So modern Hinduism, modern Islam in India, they're very much products of these processes. So what happens now? The thesis is not that, and that's why America is not exceptional. Of course not. It follows historical processes and political processes in any other country. And so what happened is that as religion has become involved in politics in a way in which a lot of people find basically problematic, especially young people, then they become alienated from this particular form of institutional religion. So it's not that finally Americans are becoming modern like Europeans, they were never modern before, but simply that's a response to very political processes in America today. People are simply taking an anti-institutional, anti-religion attitude. So young people are turned off because they don't understand the position of the churches on gender issues. And therefore they are simply fed up and don't want to have to do anything with these religions. So, but this is nothing to do with secularization in the sense in which inevitable modernization, it has to do precisely with political struggles and the role which churches play in those struggles.
So you don't see any longer term forces at work in the direction of, well, for lack of a better term, secularization. Let's take atheism, right, as an identifier.
Yeah, no, sure. No, I mean, Robert Cimino is the expert, of course, on atheism and the nones. I mean, he's my own student. And as Robert knows, what was interesting about those groups, that they had to somehow develop themselves as denominations to be recognized, the right to exist the way religious minorities have a right to exist. So their first organization was, I'm also a denomination. We non-believers have also the right to be recognized. That's why when Obama in the second presidential inaugural address welcome not only the non-Christian religions, Hindus and Buddhists and Muslims, but actually non-believers into the American civil religion. So it was not only non-Christians, but non-believers and our gay and lesbian brothers and sisters into the American civil religion. So it was opening precisely this notion of a social contract. Who are we, the people who belongs? Fully rightly.
Yeah. All right, let's get through some more questions, continuing our tour here. This is from Juanildo Buriti about Latin America. Okay, are you ready? Okay. How do you assess current forms of public religion in Latin America, considering we have not only plain conservative or right-wing forms? What hope is there in your view for this kind of pluralism of cultures and religions to find expression within Latin American societies?
About 2 months ago, a huge book on religiones en las esferas públicas de América Latina. It's a huge, great collection of about 20 different researchers. And I've written the prologue to the book, and I was part of advisor to the project. And what comes out of the project is the pluralization of religions and the pluralization of public spaces. that the fragmentation of authority, nobody controls religion, nobody controls the public sphere. So it is this pluralization, left and right, and of gender and indigenous and all kinds of issues. And so it is this which really is what distinguishes the new model of a radically pluralistic, you could almost say cacophonic civil society. And so I recommend that you look for this book. It's edited by René de la Torre and Pablo Seman, published by Claxo and I don't remember, both in Buenos Aires and Mexico City. It's also on digital online.
Related to this, could you say something about Pope Francis and his Latin American roots? Does his background help us to understand his role as Pope?
Yes, because in Argentina, although his own background is that of Peronism, and therefore it was a kind of political populism, then obviously he had to come to terms with the civil war within the church, within the Jesuit order, and the question of pluralism, and then the kind of the neoliberalization, economic neoliberalization, and what it meant for the dismantling of the welfare state in the Peronist welfare state in Argentina. So he noticed the path that a lot of people, what we will call the informal economy, they discarded, that this was an economy that was not really exploited by capitalism, but had to survive in the interstices precisely outside of capitalism, outside of markets. And so he became interested in what he calls the three T's, the people without techos, tierra, trabajo, the landless, the homeless, and the I guess the
unemployed.
Yeah, the unemployed.
Yeah.
And so he addressed those social movements, and he expected they were the ones to need to create conditions, because neither the old trade unions nor the populist parties could not respond to these needs. So they will have to somehow both, because he had seen how these people from below, through solidarity, through working together, have found ways of surviving, of self-relying on each other, that this was the kind of experience that was needed to be generalized into social movements. So he organized the social movements, had a meeting in La Paz, in Bolivia, and then he welcomed them to Rome. And then this is also the model to work with the immigrants and refugees, and the need precisely to give them recognition of their human dignity because they're outside the system. And so we have to create spaces, and the system itself is not interested in them because they neither vote nor pay taxes, if you wish, nor really contribute to capitalist development. So they are discarded. And so the question is then, how do we address those issues?
Very good. Well, in the last 10 minutes or so of our time together, we have a series of questions that relate more specifically back to the COVID-19 crisis. And so let's go through some of those. This is from Metropolitan of the Orthodox Church in Zimbabwe and Angola, Seraphim Kukotis, who asks, do you think the common threat of the COVID-19 pandemic could bring a sort of social solidarity to our more modern secular world at the level of individuals, local communities, nations, and at the continental and international level? And what is the role for religious leaders in such a transformation?
Well, as an Orthodox leader, as you are aware, one of the fundamental new developments in global Orthodoxy is the development precisely of global networks, of global links. The reemergence is not only the reemergence of the papacy, but the reemergence precisely of the ecumenical patriarch in Constantinople, precisely when he's also a prisoner also of, in Istanbul, a prisoner of the Turkish state, and yet has become now a transnational global leader of Orthodoxy. But of course, he competes with the other leader of Orthodoxy, the Moscow Patriarchate, that claim supremacy. So now there is for Orthodoxy, the problem is they have first to put their own house in order. and be able to recognize each other as brother Orthodox rather than calling each other schismatics before they can work together with others. But we see the attempt of the Russian Orthodox Church, the Moscow Patriarchate, to become involved in transnational global culture wars in defense of the family, of traditional values, of traditional Christian values, against feminism, liberalism, against the European Union, against secularism. So the question is, again, whether the task is really to become involved in the global culture wars, which are polarizing, and become a part of the global culture wars, or whether they are able to bridge, to build bridges, to encounter the other, to work together for the common good, not only for our own denomination, not only for Catholics, not only for Orthodox, not only for Jews, not only for Muslims, but really for all humanity.
Very good. We have a related question from Milda Alisikini. The question is, how, if at all, can different religions help reconcile science and religion in cases like climate change and COVID vaccinations? So the old religion-science tension in our global era. What do you think? Yeah.
There are a lot, I think, of problematic assumptions about the conflict between religion and science. There has been a very, very tortuous relationship since the modern scientific revolution. And it's very different today. I mean, the Catholic Church had problem, if you wish, with the early modern scientific revolution. But then when it came Darwinian revolution, it never really was a problem to accept evolution as a scientific doctrine. And that's also why environmentalism and cosmophysics and so on, the Vatican today is at the very much at the almost, one could say, cutting edge of the debates around all kinds of the frontiers of scientific issues having to do with biology, with genetics, with artificial intelligence, and cosmophysics, and so on. We know that in the case of the evangelicals, it was different. The Protestants had no problem with science until the Darwinian revolution. Newtonian physics had no problem for Protestantism. It was the Darwinian revolution that created the crisis that in the United States remains. So the US is rather an outlier here, especially within the Western world, of a Christian society that is extremely, extremely skeptical of science. So you have the paradox of the society that produces in universities more Nobel Prizes in science than any other society, but half of the population doesn't believe in science. So this is part of the modern cacophony of our information age, of mass media, of fake news, and the fundamental mistrust of any kind of authority. So the problem of authority. So this is to a certain extent a consequence of the absolute attack on every form of authority and tradition, which modernity made. But now really it is the modern liberals that try to defend some authority of science. And it was the old traditionalists that do not accept any authority of science today, right? So these are the paradoxes of our crisis of authority today, that it is the most modernist and liberal that try to rescue some authority to truth, to science against pure fake news, while basically the religious believers don't believe in it.
Well, let's return to sort of our position here at Georgetown for the last 5 minutes or so. There's a question from our colleague, Jerry McGlone, against the backdrop of our conversation about the crises associated with COVID-19 and where we move forward. How might Jesuits, he asks, how might the Society of Jesus as a transnational religious order with transnational and national schools and institutes help and be perhaps more focused on this effort of grappling with these new global challenges?
I mean, one of the paradoxes, of course, after the suppression, the Society of Jesus returned almost really as a caricature of the false accusations of what had been accused when it was suppressed. It was anti-modern, anti-liberal, anti-science, anti-enlightenment, etc., anti-democracy. But it sort of became that, and because of that, an anti-modern nation state. And so it was thrown out of every European country, of every Catholic country, and took refuge in America. So the paradox is that the Jesuits order that was expelled from every European and Latin American country found refuge in America. And here again, they began their global missions again, but also established so many universities that basically made them almost, if you wish, sedentary. The Jesuits were always trying to combine the two, to be contemplatives in action, to be missionaries, and they were afraid of being sedentary. That's why at first they were against the schools. So the question is how to go to the peripheries, to use the universities not precisely simply to serve your center, but precisely to open up to the rest of the world. And the task of, I think, the Jesuit universities, precisely because they are everywhere, to form networks, that they are able to look for global encounters, global communication, global ways of understanding the problems, because they have centers everywhere. So these centers, rather than being purely local centers, will become networks of global centers, networks of global processes. And I think this is what many of the pastoral, I mean, in Latin America, as you know, in the 60s, 70s, there was a lot of question about whether they should not give up the schools because they are simply schools for the upper classes, for the bourgeoisie. They should go to the poor. But it will be a pity if they go purely into the periphery and they do not remain also in the centers of power, but not to stay there, as Pope Francis says, but to open processes. So the idea is not to occupy spaces and sit there, but to take these spaces as an opportunity to open up to the rest of the world.
And thinking of Georgetown, our home, and American Jesuit universities more broadly, do you see a special role for our institutions being in the United States, a country that has been so blessed, that has such influence, to initiate, but also to listen and learn from other Jesuit institutions around the world? Yeah.
Of course, I mean, Georgetown is unique because it was established when there was actually no Jesuit order, right, at the time of the suppression. And it was also established as very much an American patriotic institution. So in the very seal of Georgetown, you have the eagle and basically a pluribus unum. So you have basically a very close fusion of American patriotism and Jesuit identity. But of course, this patriotism is linked to democracy and to an opening to change, to the world. And so as opposed to precisely many Jesuits that came from Europe and from Latin America expelled and brought this anti-democratic, anti-American kind of idea, Georgetown remained an Americanist institution within the Catholic Church and has always been that. And the School of Foreign Service was then opening in World War I precisely to this foreign service. The Jesuits should not recognize the difference between domestic and foreign service. They are an order dedicated to service to everybody. Domestic, foreign, there is no separation. There should be no separation for the Jesuits.
Well, thank you, Jose, for that call to action. I kind of want to come full circle, though, and return to your career and your path. We've covered so much ground, so much history, but also a lot of geography in a short time. I know you're working on several projects. Would you like to share a little bit the issues that you're grappling with in your own research in this phase of your career?
Well, the biggest issue comes out of precisely of the Jesuits project, which is still the big book. I mean, it took the public religions was in the making 10 years, from 1987 really to 94, 7 years really. So I'm basically now in the midst of probably 5 years within my head, how to do for our theories of globalization what public religions did to our theories of modernity and secularization. Basically, I use the project of the Jesuits to free myself from the Eurocentrism of sociology, which is basically a theory of modernity, a theory of Western modernity, and cannot understand globalization, but precisely an expansion of Western modernity to the globe. And so the idea was to use the Jesuits to point to the fact that the first phase of globalization was before Western hegemony, before European hegemony, and before modernity. and that this new global era we are entering is not simply a continuation of Western hegemony, is something very different that has a lot of similarities with the world that was not yet systemic, had no center periphery, had global connected histories, but no center and periphery yet, the way it developed precisely in the second phase. So this is the most important, if you wish, big project that hopefully within the next 2-3 years, something important will come out as a major book, I hope.
Wonderful. Well, we look forward to accompanying your work and reflecting with you on these big issues going forward. In conclusion, I want to thank you, Jose. I also want to thank Ruth Gopin and Shimong Tong for their excellent support for this event, as well as all of those who've joined us online. And I'll mention again that we will be posting the video with captioning in the days and weeks to come. We'll let you know when it's out so you can share it with your colleagues. And thanks again for joining us. Thank you, Jose.